The question of whether Peter Parker could be immortal is one that dives deep into both the physiological aspects of his powers and the philosophical implications of living forever. Peter's unique abilities, granted by the radioactive spider bite, endow him with enhanced strength, agility, reflexes, and an accelerated healing factor. While these abilities do not make him invincible, they significantly extend his longevity compared to an average human being. Peter's healing factor, while not on the same level as Wolverine or Deadpool, allows him to recover from injuries faster and more efficiently than most, possibly slowing his aging process. Over time, this ability could theoretically allow him to live much longer than a typical human, perhaps even centuries. However, the question remains whether this healing factor could fully stave off the effects of aging, or whether there are other biological limitations Peter would eventually face. Peter's scientific mind, combined with his experience as Spider-Man, could lead him to explore the possibility of using his powers to slow down aging. With his understanding of genetics and biology, he might seek out ways to enhance his healing factor, pushing it to the limits. He could potentially even turn to advanced technologies or scientific breakthroughs that could further extend his life, perhaps utilizing methods like gene therapy, cybernetic enhancements, or even cryogenics. However, the real question is not just about the possibility of immortality, but whether Peter, with his strong moral compass and deep sense of responsibility, would pursue such a life. Immortality could come with significant emotional and psychological challenges. Watching loved ones grow old and die while remaining the same age could become an unbearable burden for Peter. His sense of guilt, shaped by the loss of his Uncle Ben and the people he has failed to protect, could be magnified by the endless cycle of life and death around him. Moreover, Peter's role as a hero is not just defined by his powers, but by the connections he makes with others. His relationships with Mary Jane, Aunt May, and his friends are central to his identity. If Peter were to live forever, he would outlive the people he cares about, forcing him to witness their decline and death. This could lead to isolation, a sense of loneliness that immortality often brings. He would have to find new ways to cope with the emotional toll of immortality, potentially becoming more detached from the world he once fought for. His dedication to protecting others and his guilt over the loss of those close to him could leave him in a constant state of internal conflict. The question also extends beyond just his biological capacity for immortality. In the Marvel Universe, there are other characters who have achieved immortality through magical means or cosmic powers. Characters like Thor and Doctor Strange have found ways to extend their lives either through their divine nature or mystical means. If Peter were to pursue immortality, he could potentially seek out these other avenues. He might turn to magical artifacts, such as the Eye of Agamotto or the Time Stone, which have the power to manipulate time and life. Additionally, characters like Tony Stark could offer technological solutions using advanced AI and cybernetics to preserve Peter's body and mind. However, these options would come with their own set of risks and moral dilemmas. The use of magical or technological means to extend life could create a conflict with Peter's own sense of what is natural and right. Another factor to consider is the effect immortality would have on Peter's psyche. Throughout his life, Peter has been driven by the understanding that life is short and precious. His sense of responsibility stemming from the death of Uncle Ben is built on the idea that every action has consequences because time is finite. If Peter were to achieve immortality, would his sense of urgency and responsibility wane over time? Could he become apathetic to the struggles of others if he knew he could live forever, outlasting any problem or conflict? The philosophy of "with great power comes great responsibility" might become more difficult to maintain when Peter no longer faces the same time constraints that once shaped his actions. Without the looming reality of his own mortality, Peter might struggle to maintain the same level of dedication to protecting the innocent. The ethical implications of immortality are vast. Peter's sense of responsibility might push him to protect the world and continue his heroics forever. But there is always the danger that living too long could lead to moral complacency or a loss of empathy. At what point does immortality become a curse rather than a gift? Could Peter ever find peace with the endless passage of time, or would the weight of immortality eventually become too much for him to bear? Moreover, the idea of immortality in Peter's context would raise questions about the role of power in shaping one's life. Would Peter's extended life make him more detached from the struggles of ordinary people? Would he be able to continue connecting with others and stay true to the values that have defined him as Spider-Man, or would the distance between him and the world only grow? Ultimately, the question of whether Peter Parker could be immortal depends not just on his powers, but on his personal journey and the ethical dilemmas he would face. While it is conceivable that Peter's enhanced healing factor could extend his life far beyond the normal human lifespan, true immortality would come with emotional, psychological, and philosophical consequences. The challenge of immortality is not just about surviving time, but about maintaining one's sense of purpose, connection to others, and commitment to doing what is right. For Peter, who has always been driven by the need to protect and help others, immortality might offer him the chance to make an even greater impact on the world. But it also raises the question, how long could he remain true to himself and his mission if time itself were no longer an enemy? The answer might lie in how Peter chooses to navigate the balance between the power of immortality and the responsibility that comes with it. As we explore the idea of Peter Parker's immortality further, we must consider the broader implications for his relationships and his role in the world. While Peter's powers, notably his healing factor, could theoretically extend his life, the psychological and emotional consequences of such a long life would be enormous. Peter has always struggled with guilt and responsibility, but living forever would force him to confront these feelings on a much deeper level. Imagine Peter watching his loved ones, family, friends, and romantic partners grow old and eventually pass away while he remains the same. The pain of losing those closest to him could weigh even more heavily than the battles with supervillains he faced as Spider-Man. His connection to Aunt May, the person who raised him, would become even more poignant. Peter has already witnessed the effects of time on Aunt May, and though she continues to be a guiding figure in his life, her aging presents him with a constant reminder of his own mortality. If Peter were immortal, it would be emotionally devastating to watch her grow frail and eventually pass away, knowing that he would continue to live on without her. This scenario would force Peter to grapple with the consequences of his immortality, being stuck in time while the world around him changes. Peter's romantic relationships would also be tested. His relationship with Mary Jane is already complicated by the emotional burdens he carries. If Peter were immortal, he would have to watch as Mary Jane ages, potentially leading her to wonder why Peter hasn't aged at all, and whether she could continue a relationship with someone who would never grow old alongside her. Over time, the strain of immortality on relationships could drive Peter into isolation, as he becomes increasingly distanced from the world he once fought to protect. The fear of seeing his loved ones die, coupled with the realization that he would remain the same, could push Peter to retreat emotionally and mentally. Immortality would challenge Peter's very sense of self-worth. Peter has always defined himself through his relationships, and the acts of heroism he performed as Spider-Man. If he were to live forever, how would he continue to find meaning in his life? Peter has often struggled with the weight of his responsibilities, driven by the guilt of his uncle's death and the burden of his powers. If time were no longer a limiting factor, would Peter lose his drive to help others? Would the endless passage of time lead to a sense of apathy? Or would he be able to maintain his moral compass and continue to fight for justice, despite the emotional and psychological toll immortality would take? The idea of immortality also presents an interesting dynamic within the larger Marvel universe. Peter's relationship with other superheroes, like the Avengers, Daredevil, and Doctor Strange, would be impacted. Would Peter's immortality lead him to become a symbol of eternal hope, or would it cast a shadow over the world's heroes? Could Peter continue to fight alongside others, or would his constant presence and agelessness make him an outlier among those who age and die? His immortality could place him in a difficult position where he might feel disconnected from those who share similar struggles but experience the passage of time differently. In a world where Peter Parker is immortal, the very notion of power and responsibility would be called into question. Peter has always believed that with great power comes great responsibility, but immortality might force him to reconsider the meaning of responsibility. Should he intervene in every situation if he knows he has all the time in the world? Would the temptation to live a quiet, more selfish life outweigh his desire to protect others? The weight of immortality would shift Peter's worldview, requiring him to make difficult decisions about how much of himself he should give to the world and how much he should keep for himself. On a larger scale, the consequences of Peter's immortality could impact the entire Marvel universe. What happens when a hero or a villain lives for centuries? Immortality would change the dynamic of heroism, as characters who live beyond normal human lifespans might begin to lose their connection to the human experience. Could Peter, even with all his strength and intellect, remain grounded in the realities of the world around him if he were to live forever? Would he lose his empathy for humanity, seeing it through the lens of eternal life, or would he continue to fight for justice no matter how long he lived? Additionally, the issue of immortality in the Marvel universe is not without its supernatural elements. Immortal beings, such as Thor, or characters like the Eternals, have often faced their own struggles with purpose and meaning. Peter, if granted immortality, would likely find himself confronting these cosmic questions. His encounters with beings of immense power, such as the gods of Asgard or the cosmic entities, would challenge his own understanding of what it means to be human and whether he should be part of their immortal realms. Would he become tempted by the idea of gaining greater cosmic power, or would he remain true to the ideals that have always guided him? The role of immortality also brings up an important question about legacy. If Peter were to live forever, how would he leave a lasting impact on the world? His legacy as Spider-Man has already been built on the small, everyday victories, the lives he saved, the people he helped, the hope he inspired in the face of adversity. However, the idea of living forever forces Peter to think about how his actions would resonate over time. Would he remain relevant? Would his ideals continue to shape future generations? Immortality could give Peter an eternal chance to leave behind a legacy, but it could also risk the fading of his influence if he becomes disconnected from the world he fought so hard to protect. In conclusion, the possibility of Peter Parker being immortal brings with it complex questions of identity, responsibility, and the nature of time itself. All his powers could theoretically allow him to outlive others. The emotional and psychological toll of living forever could be insurmountable. Peter's journey would become not just a fight for survival, but a search for meaning in a world that keeps moving forward while he remains static. The idea of immortality raises questions not only about Peter's powers, but also about the human experience and what it means to live a full and meaningful life. For Peter Parker, the true challenge may not be achieving immortality, but maintaining the values that define him, even as time stretches on indefinitely. Peter Parker stood atop a building, the city sprawling beneath him, the cool breeze brushing past his face. His mind wasn't on the usual patrol or the latest villain trying to wreak havoc. Tonight, there were no criminals to catch or innocent lives to save. Tonight, Peter Parker was thinking about something much deeper, much more personal: immortality. It wasn't the first time the thought had crossed his mind. Ever since his powers had started to evolve, Peter had wondered just how much longer he could live. He had healed from injuries that would have killed any other person, and his body had remained youthful long after his peers had aged. But he was still human, still bound by time, still driven by guilt, still carrying the weight of responsibilities that had shaped him since that fateful day the spider bit him. Was it possible for someone like him to live forever? And if it was, should he even want it? In his early days as Spider-Man, he had been driven by the idea of making a difference. He had clung to the notion that every life mattered, and that his role as a hero was critical to keeping the balance. But the years had changed him. He'd grown older, wiser perhaps, but also more tired. And the people around him, those he loved, like Aunt May and Mary Jane, hadn't escaped the cruel march of time. He'd seen Mary Jane age, her smile not quite as youthful as it had been when they first met. Aunt May, the woman who had always been his rock, had grown frail with age, her once steady hand now trembling as she reached for his. What would immortality mean for him, for them? Could he watch Mary Jane, the love of his life, grow old and eventually pass away while he remained the same? Could he endure the pain of losing everyone around him, knowing that he would continue to live untouched by time? And yet, wasn't that the very essence of what being Spider-Man had always been about? Sacrifice, loss, the constant reminder that life was fragile. But immortality would make him watch the world change without ever being able to truly stop it. He thought of the heroes he'd known. Thor, the Asgardian god who had lived for centuries. Doctor Strange, whose use of magic kept him youthful. And even characters like the Eternal, who had never known death. They all faced the same struggles: the weight of witnessing time pass, the feeling of outliving friends and foes alike. The question Peter always asked himself was, could he endure that? Could he be a man who lived forever, detached from everything he had known and loved? Or would the endless passage of time break him down, turn him into something cold, something far from the compassionate, driven person he had always strived to be? He looked down at the city below him. New York, his city, the city that had seen him grow from a shy, awkward teenager into the man he was now. A man who had made countless sacrifices for the greater good. A man who had faced villains and monsters but never really faced himself. Never truly confronted the idea of living forever. He had the power to stop aging, to heal himself faster than anyone else. But even that wasn't immortality, not in the truest sense. His healing factor could only slow down his biological decay. It wasn't a cure for time itself. He might live a lot longer than a normal person, but eventually his body would wear down. His mind would grow weary. His powers, though extraordinary, couldn't stop him from eventually succumbing to the ravages of time. His human limitations, his very DNA, would eventually catch up with him. In the end, Immortality was still a dream, not a reality. Or at least, that's what Peter had always believed. But lately, that belief had started to waver. He had been researching, using his intellect in ways he hadn't before, and what he found was unsettling. There were ways, in theory, that his healing factor could be enhanced. There were scientists, doctors, and even mystical figures who had unlocked the secret to eternal life. It wasn't simple, and it wasn't something Peter would ever embrace lightly, but the possibility of immortality was there, within his grasp. He had always prided himself on using his powers for good. But the more he thought about it, the more the idea of immortality felt like a curse. A curse that would rob him of everything he had ever known, his family, his friends, his connections. Time was what made life precious. What gave every moment meaning. To live forever would mean to lose that sense of urgency, that sense of knowing that every moment mattered. And for Peter, it was that very urgency that had driven him to do good, to help those in need. Without the understanding of mortality, would his purpose still hold the same weight, or would he become numb to the world around him, detached from the very thing that made him human? As he stood there, looking over the city, Peter thought about Aunt May, about Mary Jane, and all the people who had come into his life. He had always believed that the loss of someone was what gave life meaning. The fleeting nature of life was what made every decision, every sacrifice, so important. But could he truly accept immortality, knowing that it would strip that away? He had always thought he could bear anything, as long as he was helping people, as long as he was making a difference. But immortality would mean facing an endless cycle of watching the world grow, change, and age, without ever being able to escape it. There was no clear answer to his question. He didn't know if he could live forever, or if it was even worth it. The only thing Peter knew for certain was that he couldn't make that decision alone. He needed to talk to Mary Jane, to Aunt May, to those closest to him, because immortality wasn't just about him. It was about everyone he cared about, and he would never make such a monumental decision without considering the consequences. For now, though, Peter Parker would continue to swing through the streets of New York, fighting for what was right, doing what he could to protect the people he loved. And when the time came, if the time ever came, he would face whatever lay ahead with the same sense of responsibility he had always carried, not because of the powers he possessed, but because of the person he had always been. Immortal or not, Peter Parker was still the hero the world needed. Peter Parker had always been a man of action, but now, with the thought of immortality gnawing at him, he was paralyzed. He couldn't escape the weight of the decision, nor could he ignore the reality of what it would mean to live forever. Immortality wasn't just about never aging, it was about watching everyone else grow old, outliving your friends, your family, and perhaps even your purpose. The next day, he sat in the coffee shop, where he and Mary Jane often met. The familiar hum of conversation around him felt distant. She was sitting across from him, her smile as warm as ever, but Peter felt an emotional wall between them. He didn't want to burden her with this fear, this uncertainty, but how could he go on without sharing it? How could he keep pretending that everything was fine, that the weight of immortality hadn't already begun to change the way he saw the world? "Pete, you've been quiet," Mary Jane said, her voice tinged with concern. "What's going on? You've been distant for days now." Peter shifted in his seat, staring at his coffee cup, swirling it absently. "I've been thinking about something," he admitted, his voice low. "Something big." Mary Jane studied him closely, her brow furrowed. "What is it? You know you can tell me anything, right?" He took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be easy. He had always struggled to share his burdens. But he couldn't carry this one alone. That's been wondering, could I be immortal? Mary Jane blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Immortal? What do you mean, like, unkillable? Peter nodded, his gaze locked onto his hands. I don't know, but my healing factor, the way I recover from injuries, I've been researching it. There's a way I could extend my life, possibly forever. I've always known my powers could heal me faster than others, but I never really thought about what that means in the long term. Could I live beyond what's natural? Could I live to see the world change over and over and still be here? Mary Jane sat back, processing his words. Peter. Her voice was soft but firm, filled with the care she had for him. Are you sure you want to live forever? Peter shook his head slowly, feeling the weight of the question. I don't know. That's the problem. I can stop thinking about it. The idea of outliving everyone, watching you grow old, seeing Aunt May, my friends. They be gone, and I still be here. That thought terrifies me. Mary Jane reached across the table, placing her hand gently on his. I know it's hard, Pete, but you're human, and being human means accepting that we're not in control of everything. We can't stop time, and we can't control what happens to the people we love. You've been through so much already, more than anyone should ever have to endure. Maybe that's enough. Peter looked at her, searching her eyes for the truth of what she was saying. He could see the love, the understanding, but there was also a subtle sadness there, a knowing look that made him wonder if she understood this more deeply than he had realized. Is it selfish of me? Peter asked, his voice barely a whisper, to want to keep living when I know it would hurt so many people. Mary Jane squeezed his hand, her voice steady. It's not selfish to want to live, Pete. But immortality isn't just about surviving. It's about what you do with the time you have. You've already done more than most people could ever dream of. You've given so much of yourself, and I know you've made a difference. But you can't control time. None of us can. And maybe the most important thing you can do is accept the time you have and make the most of it. Peter's chest tightened as he absorbed her words. He had always been driven by the fear of not doing enough, of not living up to his potential. But Mary Jane was right. He couldn't control time, and he couldn't keep running from it. The world would keep moving forward, whether or not he wanted it to. I've always thought that, with my powers, I was meant to protect everyone, to be there for the people I love. Peter said quietly, but I never really thought about what happens when there's no one left to protect. You don't have to protect everyone, Pete. Mary Jane replied. You've already given so much. Sometimes, letting go is the hardest part of love. It's not about saving everyone. It's about being there for them, for the time you have, and cherishing that. Peter closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. Maybe immortality wasn't the answer. Maybe the fear of outliving everyone wasn't what he needed to focus on. Maybe it was time to focus on the present, on the people around him, the love he shared, and the life he had right now. Thank you, MJ, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I've been afraid of losing everything for so long, but maybe I need to learn to accept that some things aren't meant to last forever. Mary Jane smiled softly, a tear glistening in the corner of her eye. You are not alone, Pete, and you never will be. Peter leaned forward, his heart finally beginning to feel lighter. The future, whether finite or infinite, was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: he didn't have to carry the weight of immortality alone. He had people in his life who cared about him, and that was enough. For now, Peter Parker would live in the moment, embracing the time he had, knowing that even in a world full of uncertainty, the one thing he could control was how he chose to live. Whether or not immortality was within his grasp, Peter had come to understand that it was the choices he made, the love he shared, and the lives he touched that would define his legacy, not the passage of time. Peter's conversation with Mary Jane had left him with much to think about as he walked through the streets of New York, the city that had both shaped him and been shaped by him. He couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of clarity. The weight that had once felt unbearable was beginning to feel more like a challenge he could face head-on. His immortality, whether real or merely a passing thought, no longer seemed like something to fear or chase. Instead of worrying about living forever, Peter realized he needed to focus on living now. He couldn't control what the future held, and he had spent far too much of his life worrying about the potential for loss that he hadn't truly embraced the present. There were still moments to cherish, people to protect, and a city that needed him. Maybe immortality wasn't the answer, but the connections he had, his relationships, his love for Mary Jane, his bond with Aunt May, those were the things that truly gave his life meaning. His thoughts were interrupted as he looked up at the skyline, the familiar hum of the city filling his senses, the city that had never stopped moving, a living, breathing entity. He had always tried to balance his dual identity. Peter Parker, the man, and Spider-Man, the hero. But now, it seemed like the answer was in letting those identities merge into one. He didn't need to be Spider-Man forever. What mattered was how he used his time, however long that would be. The choice to be a hero didn't depend on immortality. It depended on the values he chose to live by and the people he chose to protect. Peter's first stop was the one person who had always been there for him, Aunt May. She had been his constant source of strength, guiding him through the ups and downs of his life. As he knocked on her door and stepped into her apartment, he saw the familiar warmth in her eyes, the same love and care she had always shown him. "Peter," Aunt May said with a soft smile, noticing the contemplative look in his eyes. "What sep's on your mind, dear?" He sat down across from her, the weight of his earlier thoughts still pressing on his chest. "Has Ep been thinking a lot lately, Aunt May? About life, about time, about immortality?" Aunt May chuckled softly, her wisdom showing through her eyes. "Well, Peter, I think you know what I'm gonna say. Time is precious. It's the one thing we can't control, no matter how hard we try. And sometimes, the best thing we can do with our time is love those around us and make a difference in the moment. You've always done that." Peter looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. She had lived a full life, faced hardships that would have broken most people, and yet she had always been able to find joy in the little things. "I've always been afraid of losing the people I love, Aunt May. But maybe immortality isn't what I should be focusing on. I can't stop time, but I can make sure the time I have counts." Aunt May nodded, her smile softening. "Peter, Yusuf always understood the most important thing. You can control the future, but you can control how you live today. That sits where your real power lies." For the first time in a long while, Peter felt a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't need to live forever. He just needed to live. And in that living, he could make a difference. Not just as Spider-Man, but as Peter Parker. A man who cared, a man who loved, a man who wanted to leave the world a little better than he found it. Later that evening, he returned to Mary Jane's apartment, a new sense of clarity in his heart. He had made his decision. It wasn't immortality he needed. It was balance, love, and purpose in the time he had. Mary Jane was waiting for him, and as he stepped inside, he saw the familiar warmth in her eyes. She had always understood him more than anyone else ever could. "Has been thinking," Peter said, a smile forming on his lips. "And I made up my mind. I don't need to live forever. I just need to make sure that for however long I have, I make it count. With you, with Aunt May, with everyone I care about." Mary Jane smiled, a relieved, knowing smile. "I'm glad, Pete, because no matter what happens, we got each other, and that's what really matters." In that moment, Peter realized that immortality wasn't about surviving forever. It was about living in a way that left an impact on the people you loved, on the world you cared about. Whether his time was finite or extended, what mattered most was how he spent that time. As he sat with Mary Jane looking out at the city, he knew he had made the right choice. No more running from time, no more worrying about the future. He would face whatever came his way, knowing that each moment, each second, was an opportunity to be the best version of himself. The greatest gift he could give to the world wasn't eternal life. It was the life he lived, the love he gave, and the difference he made while he was here. Peter Parker, whether he lived for another day or another century, had finally come to understand that true immortality was never about never dying. It was about living with purpose and making every second count. Peter sat in his room, the quiet hum of New York City drifting through the open window. The decision had been made. He wasn't going to chase immortality, but as the city continued to live its ever-changing life below him, he knew that his role in it hadn't changed. The weight of his responsibilities still lingered, though now it was lighter, more manageable. The understanding that his time wasn't infinite, that every day mattered, was a new kind of freedom. But even with this clarity, there were challenges. Peter had always been driven by the notion that every action had consequences, and in some ways, this idea would become even more profound as he moved forward. Time was precious, and it wasn't just his own he had to worry about. His role as Spider-Man had always been about more than personal survival. It was about the people he protected, the lives he touched, and the world that depended on him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had already achieved the kind of immortality that truly mattered. His impact on the world, even without physical immortality, was already embedded in the legacy of Spider-Man. It wasn't about whether he would live forever, it was about how his actions would resonate long after he was gone. Peter had long feared the idea of being forgotten. He had often wondered what would happen if he stopped being Spider-Man. Would the city still need him? Would anyone remember the impact he had made? But in his quiet moments of reflection, he had come to a different realization. It wasn't about his name, his suit, or his powers. It was about the lessons he had imparted, the people he had saved, and the way he had inspired others to make a difference in their own lives. The city didn't need Spider-Man forever. It needed Peter Parker to continue doing what he had always done, using his mind, his heart, and his sense of responsibility to make the world a better place. It wasn't long before his next challenge arrived. Peter had been approached by a young man who had recently moved to the city, someone who had grown up hearing stories about Spider-Man and was now looking for guidance. The man, named Ben, had been struggling to find his place in the world. Peter saw so much of himself in Ben, the same sense of confusion, the same desire to make a difference, but also the same overwhelming fear of what that might mean. Ben had been inspired by Peter's legacy as Spider-Man, but unlike Peter, he hadn't yet figured out how to channel his passions into something productive. Peter's first instinct was to tell Ben that he didn't need to follow in his footsteps. He didn't need to wear a mask, swing from buildings, or fight villains to make a difference. Peter had learned that the greatest impact he could have was by inspiring others to find their own path, to use their own gifts for good. But as he looked into Ben's eyes, the same sense of hope and desperation Peter had once felt washed over him. Peter understood that sometimes people just needed someone to believe in them, someone to help them understand that they had the power to shape their own future. Ben, you don't need to be Spider-Man to be a hero, Peter said, his voice steady. What you do, how you help people, that's what makes you a hero. You don't need to wear a mask or take on the world all at once. You just need to find your purpose, and when you do, the rest will follow. Ben nodded slowly, taking in Peter's words. There was a long silence, and Peter could see the gears turning in Ben's mind. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when Ben would realize that he didn't have to emulate someone else to make a difference. He could carve his own path, just like Peter had done. Thanks, Ben said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. I think I finally get it. Peter smiled, watching Ben walk away with a newfound sense of direction. It was in moments like these that Peter realized the true value of his experience as Spider-Man. It wasn't the battles or the villains he faced that mattered. It was the lives he touched, the choices he made to guide others, to inspire them to be their own heroes. In the weeks that followed, Peter continued to mentor Ben, helping him navigate the complexities of life in New York. Ben wasn't going to be Spider-Man, but Peter didn't need him to be. What mattered was that Ben was finding his way, just as Peter had. The city was changing, and Peter was no longer at the forefront of that change in the same way he once was. But he had become a guide, a mentor, and someone who could help others find their own sense of purpose. One evening, as Peter and Mary Jane walked hand in hand through Central Park, Peter felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. His decision to stop chasing immortality, to focus on the present and the people he loved, had freed him. He didn't need to live forever to leave a legacy. His legacy was in the lives he had touched, the choices he had made, and the people who continued to carry his lessons forward. Pete, Mary Jane said, squeezing his hand gently, I know things have been tough, but I am so proud of you. You made the right choice. You found peace, and I can see it in your eyes. Peter smiled at her, his heart swelling with love. It's all about finding balance, MJ. We can control time, but we can control how we live in the time we have, and that's what matters. As they stood there, looking out at the city that had been both his battleground and his home, Peter understood something fundamental. He didn't need to worry about immortality. What mattered was how he lived in the moment, how he impacted the world and the people he loved, and how he used his time to build something meaningful. Whether he lived for another year or another century, he had already made a difference. And that, Peter thought, was enough. Peter Parker, now fully embracing the reality that immortality wasn't his goal, began to see the world around him in a new light. His days of wearing the Spider-Man suit and facing supervillains were becoming distant memories, but the impact of those experiences had molded him into a man who understood the weight of every action, every choice. But just because he wasn't actively saving the world didn't mean the world had stopped changing, and neither had his curiosity about his own existence, especially when it came to the question of his powers and their potential. There were theories, of course, scientific ideas that Peter had always entertained. His accelerated healing factor was undoubtedly a significant asset. But what was it really doing to him on a biological level? Could his cells regenerate indefinitely? Could his body ever be truly immortal, even if his mind wasn't? His mind had always been one of Peter's greatest assets. From his early days as a teenager to now, his intellect had often carried him through situations where strength alone wouldn't suffice. Now, with more experience under his belt, Peter began to turn his scientific acumen towards understanding his own abilities on a deeper, more molecular level. There were moments when his healing factor felt like it wasn't just about recovering from injuries, it felt like it was erasing time. He had been injured countless times, yet there were scars he couldn't seem to remember forming. Injuries from years ago felt like they happened yesterday. Was his body keeping him young, or was something more going on? Peter found himself in his lab, conducting experiments, not on the usual assortment of scientific challenges that plagued his world, but on himself. He had already proven that his genetic makeup was radically different from a regular human's thanks to that spider bite. But he had never truly analyzed what those differences meant in the long term. His scientific mind could hardly resist the urge to understand the deeper potential of his own physiology. Could he live forever? Or at least, could his body be conditioned to maintain its health indefinitely? His first step was taking blood samples, tracking his healing processes, and even examining how fast his cells regenerated after severe damage. For weeks, he meticulously studied the data, comparing his results with human aging models. Everything seemed to indicate that his regenerative abilities allowed him to slow his aging process down, possibly even stop it at some point. The implications were staggering. If Peter could keep his body in a perpetual state of recovery, he could theoretically live for hundreds of years, maybe longer. But it wasn't just the physical aspect that intrigued him. It was the psychological side. His powers had always been a double-edged sword. They granted him incredible abilities, but they also came with tremendous responsibility and, in some cases, personal sacrifice. The thought of living for centuries, seeing the world evolve and change, left Peter with a sense of unease. How would he handle the weight of immortality, the loss of those he loved, watching generations pass while he remained the same? This question, perhaps the most profound one he had ever faced, became his focus. It wasn't just about living forever, but about what immortality would do to his soul. He had spent so much of his life hiding behind the mask, trying to protect others, trying to make up for past mistakes. But now, the idea of living indefinitely forced him to ask, what kind of person would he become if time was no longer his enemy? Could he hold on to the values that made him Peter Parker? Or would time erode them as it had done with so many other immortal beings in history? There were characters in the Marvel Universe who had already explored the psychological cost of immortality. Thor, with his centuries of life, had often expressed wariness with the passage of time. Doctor Strange, too, had glimpsed the toll that long life and endless power could have on a person's soul. Even the Eternals, beings who had lived for millennia, wrestled with the meaning of life when it stretched beyond what was normal. Could Peter, a man who had always felt so tethered to the world around him, cope with the isolation of immortality? He thought about his relationship with Mary Jane, how deeply he loved her, and how, no matter how much they meant to each other, their lives would be limited by time. He would continue while she aged. Could he watch her grow old, have children, possibly even die, while he remained the same? Could he bear to outlive her, knowing that he would eventually lose her, no matter how much he loved her? The more Peter contemplated immortality, the more he realized that the real cost wasn't in the physical aspects of his powers. He could live for centuries, yes, but he didn't want to live them alone. He didn't want to watch the people he loved slip away, never able to share the same experiences with them. He had to face the brutal truth that even if he could survive the years, he might lose everything that made those years worth living. The idea of immortality wasn't just about surviving forever, it was about finding meaning in a world that moved forward without him. What would it mean to live in a world that constantly evolved, but never allowed you to age or change? Peter knew that the greatest heroes weren't the ones who fought forever. They were the ones who embraced the fleeting moments of life and made them count. And in that moment, Peter understood something that had eluded him for years. Immortality wasn't the goal. The goal was living a life worth living, one day at a time. Peter had made his peace with the idea that immortality was neither his destiny nor his desire. What had once seemed like a tempting escape from the inevitable cycle of loss and growth was now just another fleeting temptation. One he had grown to understand he didn't need. The realization was freeing. And yet, he still couldn't shake the thought of his powers, the potential of his body, and the mysteries he had yet to uncover about himself. Even if he would not live forever, there was still much to learn about what made him the way he was. And so Peter turned his attention back to his powers, particularly his healing factor, in the way a scientist obsessed over an unsolved puzzle. He wasn't looking for a way to cheat death, but rather to understand the scope of his abilities. Was his regenerative capacity something more than just a response to injury? Was there a deeper connection between his powers and the energy that flowed through his body, perhaps even tied to the very essence of his existence? One evening, as he sat in his lab, surrounded by a myriad of data, Peter's mind drifted to the people he had met over the years. He thought about those who had tried to challenge death. Heroes like the ancient ones, like the eternal, or even characters like Wolverine, who had lived through centuries, faced countless battles, and yet, in some way, remained grounded. What had they learned that Peter hadn't yet? What had immortality taught them that he needed to understand before he could fully embrace his role, whatever that would be in the time he had? Peter began to consider the possibility that his powers were not just an anomaly, they were a key part of something greater, something that connected him to the fabric of the universe itself. The spider bite, which had given him his powers, had altered his DNA. Yes, but could it also have granted him a unique link to life itself? Could his powers be the result of some cosmic intervention? After all, Spider-Man's existence was full of strange coincidences and uncanny events. His very origin was the result of something far beyond the typical realm of science. As his thoughts swirled, Peter received a call from someone he had not heard from in years. Dr. Strange. The Sorcerer Supreme had always been an enigmatic figure to Peter, someone whose understanding of the mystical realms far surpassed anything Peter had ever experienced. When Strange had reached out, it had been about an issue in the magical dimensions, but Peter was now beginning to wonder whether this call was a sign that there was something even deeper at play. Dr. Strange was no stranger to the concepts of immortality. He had lived for centuries through his magical practices and had seen the world shift and change in ways Peter could not even imagine. As a man who had mastered the manipulation of time and space, perhaps Strange held the key to understanding what Peter's powers could truly do. So, Peter met him, eager for answers. "Peter," Dr. Strange greeted him with a knowing smile, as though he had been expecting him. "I've been following your progress, and it seems you've reached a crossroad. The question of immortality is one that many face, but not all of them truly understand the weight of what it means." Peter felt a jolt in his chest, as though Strange had read his mind. "I've been thinking about it a lot, about my healing factor." about the nature of my powers. Can they truly keep me young forever, or am I simply delaying the inevitable? Strange's eyes gleamed with an understanding that came only with age and experience. Your powers, Peter, are far more than you think. They are a result of cosmic forces, forces that have given you not just strength, but resilience. But immortality, true immortality, is not what you seek. What you have is a gift of endurance, not eternal life. Peter frowned. But I don't understand. What sits the point of having these abilities if they don't lead to something greater? Can I live longer. If I could make a bigger difference. Dr. Strange held up a hand, cutting Peter off. You misunderstand. The gift you possess is not to outlive everyone around you or to see the world change without you. The true purpose of your gift, Peter, is to learn from each moment. The value of your life is not measured in how many years you live, but in the quality of the time you have. Time is finite, yes, but it is precious, and it is that very fragility that makes life meaningful. Peter absorbed the words, feeling the weight of them settle in his chest. Dr. Strange continued. The power you have to heal and regenerate is not an invitation to live forever. It is a reminder that even though you may heal, you are still part of the cycle of life. You cannot escape it. You can only live fully within it. Peter was silent for a long time, taking in everything Strange had said. It was clear now, immortality wasn't the answer. It never had been. His life, even with all its power, was still defined by the relationships he had, the impact he made, and the choices he made every day. Even if his healing factor allowed him to live longer than most, the true measure of his life was in the people he protected, the city he loved, and the moments he shared with those he cared for. I get it, Peter said finally, a quiet resolve in his voice. Living forever isn't what makes life worth it. It's the moments we have, what we do with them that counts. Dr. Strange nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Exactly, Peter. And remember this, you don't need to live forever to be a force for good in this world. You've already made more of a difference than most could in 1,000 lifetimes. What matters is that you continue to act with love and responsibility, knowing that your impact is felt, no matter how long or short your time may be. Peter left Dr. Strange's sanctum that evening with a new understanding. He wasn't meant to live forever, and neither was anyone else. The key to life, true life, was to embrace each moment, knowing it could be the last, and to make it count. In the days that followed, Peter felt lighter. The burden of immortality had lifted, and with it, a newfound clarity emerged. As he walked through the streets of New York, he saw things differently. The people, the bustling city around him, they were all part of something beautiful and fragile. And now, Peter was ready to embrace it. He didn't need to live forever to make a difference. He just needed to live fully, and that, he realized, was enough. Days passed, and Peter began to settle into his new understanding. He wasn't chasing immortality anymore. His priorities had shifted. The constant yearning for a longer life, for the chance to outlast his fears and insecurities, had melted away. Peter understood now. The true measure of his life wasn't in how many days he had, but in how much good he could do with the time he was given. One evening, as Peter swung through the streets of New York, he felt a sense of calm that had eluded him for years. The city below him, his city, was alive, vibrant, full of people with stories, struggles, dreams, and fears. The weight of every choice didn't feel like a crushing burden anymore. He no longer felt like he had to carry the world on his shoulders, nor did he feel the fear that if he wasn't there, everything would collapse. He could feel the shift within himself. Spider-Man no longer felt like a responsibility that chained him to his past mistakes. It had become a part of who he was, a part of Peter Parker, not separate from him but an extension of the man he had become. He had always thought his purpose was to save the world, to fight against evil, but now he realized that his purpose was also to be present, to love, to support, and to inspire those around him. Peter had learned that immortality, if he sought it, would not give him the peace he craved. It would only amplify his loneliness, his inability to move forward with the people he loved. Time, he realized, was finite for a reason. It was what made every moment precious. It wasn't about avoiding loss. It was about cherishing what you had while you had it. Even if Peter's healing factor allowed him to live longer than an average person, his true legacy would be how he touched the lives of others, how he shared his gifts, and how he lived in the moments given to him. One day, while visiting Aunt May, she looked at him with knowing eyes. "You sip changed, Peter," she said, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. "There are sips of peace about you now, something I haven't seen in a long time. A sip and proud of you." Peter sat beside her, his heart full. "I've spent so many years running from what I couldn't control," he said. "The fear of losing people, of not doing enough, of not having enough time. But now I see it. What I've always been afraid of isn't time running out. It's not living fully while I still have the chance." Aunt May nodded, her wisdom still sharp as ever. "That sip's the truth, Peter. You stir not running anymore. And that sip's what makes you the hero you still always been. It sip's not about how long you live. It sip's about how you live, and what you leave behind." The truth in Aunt May's words resonated deeply with him. The doubts that had once clouded his mind had dissipated, replaced by a quiet understanding. There were things beyond his control, things he couldn't change or avoid. But there were also things he could control, things that mattered. He could be present for Mary Jane, for Aunt May, for those who depended on him. He could be the man he needed to be, regardless of how long that time lasted. As he left Aunt May's apartment later that afternoon, Peter's thoughts drifted to Mary Jane. Their relationship had always been complicated, but lately there was a sense of growth between them. She had always supported him, even when he wasn't the easiest person to be with. Now, he saw how much they had both changed. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, an understanding that they didn't need to fight time, that they didn't need to run from the inevitable. They only needed to make the most of the time they had, to be there for each other, to love each other deeply. Peter had faced villains, monsters, and challenges throughout his life as Spider-Man, but none of those were as daunting as the realization that the real battle was learning how to be at peace with who he was. The idea of immortality had been a distraction, a way for him to avoid facing the things that truly mattered. And now, he was ready to face those things head-on. No more doubts, no more running, just the courage to live each day with purpose. Later that evening, he met Mary Jane for dinner at their favorite restaurant. She looked up at him as he sat down, her eyes sparkling with warmth. "You look different, Peter," she said, smiling, in a good way. "What's going on?" Peter smiled back, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I think I finally figured it out, MJ. It's not about living forever. It's about living fully. I've been given the gift of time, and I'm done worrying about how much of it I have left. What matters now is what I do with it, what we do with it." Mary Jane Sip's expression softened and she reached across the table to take his hand. "I Sips am so glad to hear you say that, Pete. I think you Sip been carrying so much weight, trying to be everything to everyone, but you don't Sift have to. You Sift are always been enough." They sat together in the quiet hum of the restaurant, sharing a moment of peace that felt like the culmination of years of struggles. Peter had fought for so long, fought against villains, fought against his own fears, fought against the inevitability of loss. But now, he understood. He didn't need to fight forever. What mattered was how he embraced the people around him, how he made his time count. Peter's phone buzzed on the table, interrupting the moment. But this time, it didn't feel like an obligation. It was just another call, another moment in the endless rhythm of life. He didn't need to rush. He didn't need to fear what was coming next. Whatever it was, he would face it with the knowledge that he had already won by accepting who he was, by embracing the love around him, and by making every second of his life meaningful. As they finished dinner, the night was clear, and Peter felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. Maybe it wasn't immortality that he had been searching for after all. Maybe it was just this, the understanding that every moment could be enough. As the days turned into weeks, Peter's life seemed to fall into a new rhythm. He was no longer haunted by the question of immortality or the fear of losing those around him. His relationship with Mary Jane flourished, rooted in the shared understanding that life, no matter how long or short, was precious. They began to make plans for the future, not the distant future, where Peter had once feared he'd be alone, but the here and now. They talked about their dreams, the things they still wanted to accomplish together. They didn't need to chase eternity anymore. They were living in the present, embracing the time they had, and that was enough. But even as Peter found peace in his personal life, the city around him had never truly stopped. New York, for all its progress and promise, was still full of challenges. Crime continued to plague the streets, albeit in quieter, less obvious ways. And as always, Peter couldn't ignore it. His mind, ever the scientist, kept returning to the idea that there were still things he could do, ways he could help, not by swinging into action as Spider-Man, but by using his knowledge and influence to make the world a better place. Peter's new purpose was clearer now. He wanted to change the city, not by fighting supervillains or saving the day in dramatic fashion, but by using his intellect to address the root causes of crime and inequality. He started working more closely with community leaders, focusing on programs to give young people opportunities, better access to education, and support systems that could help them avoid falling into a life of crime. His work was slow, but steady. He didn't need to save everyone, but if he could save a few, help a few, he knew that would be enough. One afternoon, Peter found himself in a meeting with a group of city officials. They were discussing a new initiative aimed at providing affordable health care and resources for mental health in underserved neighborhoods. Peter had already spent weeks researching the best methods to make the program sustainable. He spoke passionately, presenting data and ideas that not only made sense scientifically, but also emotionally resonated with the people in the room. He wasn't Spider-Man in that room. He was Peter Parker, a man who cared deeply about his community and wanted to make a difference, no matter how small. Later that evening, after the meeting, Peter walked through the city streets, reflecting on how far he had come. His powers were still a part of him, but they were no longer his defining characteristic. He was no longer bound by the idea that he needed to be a superhero to make an impact. It wasn't about the costume, the webs, or the grand battles. It was about the quiet moments, the personal connections, and the steady work that would create lasting change. The city didn't need Spider-Man to fight every battle. It needed Peter Parker, who could use his knowledge, his compassion, and his heart to lead by example. As he passed through the familiar streets, a sense of calm washed over him. The city hadn't changed overnight, but it was changing, slowly but surely. Peter could feel it, and while he would always have his role to play, whether through his scientific work, his mentorship of young minds, or his quiet, everyday efforts, the most important role he had was simply being present, no longer weighed down by the fear of immortality. Peter had learned that his true purpose was to live fully in the moments that mattered. As he reached his apartment, he thought about the future again, not with the anxiety he had once felt, but with a sense of hope. There was no need to chase immortality. The true beauty of life, he realized, was that it was finite, and that made every moment worth living. Mary Jane was already home when he walked through the door. She looked up from the couch, a smile spreading across her face. "How was your day?" she asked, setting aside the book she had been reading. "It was good," Peter replied, his smile genuine. "Then finally starting to feel like I been making a real difference, not as Spider-Man, but as myself." Mary Jane stood up and walked toward him, her hand brushing against his. "I'm proud of you, Pete. You've always been a hero in my eyes. You don't need the suit to be one." Peter took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of her words settle in his heart. Come to realize that, MJ. I don't need the suit. I just need to be the best version of myself. That's all I can do." And in that moment, Peter knew that the journey he had embarked on was far from over. There would always be challenges, always be obstacles. But he had a purpose now that wasn't tied to the fear of losing everyone he loved. He had found peace in knowing that he could live fully, make a difference, and embrace the people around him without the looming question of immortality hanging over him. As they sat together, the city lights flickering outside their window, Peter Parker realized that the future wasn't something to be feared, it was something to be embraced, one step at a time. As Peter settled into his new routine, embracing the balance between his personal life, his work, and his community involvement, the city around him continued to evolve. It wasn't an immediate transformation, change never was, but every small step, every conversation, every initiative he contributed to was slowly starting to shift the fabric of New York City. He didn't need to swing through the streets or stop crime with his fists to make a difference. Instead, Peter found power in his ability to inspire, to help people see a better way forward. But, as the days passed, something else began to stir within Peter. A nagging feeling that, despite all his progress, something was still missing. There was a part of him that couldn't fully shake off the old urge to do more, to be more than just the man behind the mask. Perhaps it was the scientist in him, the part of Peter Parker that had always been curious and driven to find answers. Or perhaps it was the hero that still burned within him, the part of him that wanted to continue protecting his city, even without the need for webs and a suit. One afternoon, while Peter was reviewing data from a recent outreach project, he got an unexpected visitor. A young woman, looking tired but determined, stood in his office doorway. She was in her late 20s, wearing a jacket with a logo from a local community outreach program. "Are you Peter Parker?" she asked, her voice a little hesitant, but confident enough to hold his attention. Peter stood up from his desk and smiled, trying to put her at ease. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" I'm not sure if you remember me," she began, her voice cracking slightly, "but I used to be one of the kids you helped when you were out as Spider-Man." I was part of one of the programs you worked with. You probably don't remember, but you saved my brother years ago. You helped him get back on the right path." Peter's eyes widened as the memory clicked. He did remember, a kid named Marcus. He'd been caught up in the wrong crowd and had almost paid the price for it. Spider-Man had stopped him from making a fatal mistake, and Peter had worked to help get Marcus into a mentorship program that would set him straight. Marcus had been one of many kids Peter had helped over the years, but hearing that someone had actually remembered, had been inspired by his actions, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of real, lasting impact. "I remember Marcus," Peter said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "How is he doing?" "He's doing great," the woman replied, her eyes lighting up with pride. "He's got a job now, working in tech. He turned his life around, and now he wants to help others, just like you helped him. We've started a new program, one that's focused on using technology to help kids get into better schools, to help them stay out of trouble. We need someone with your skills, someone who understands how to give back to the community, someone who believes in second chances." Peter stood in silence for a moment, taking in her words. He had always hoped that the small changes he made, the tiny acts of kindness, would eventually ripple outward. To see it in action, to know that someone had turned their life around because of something he had done, it was more fulfilling than any fight against a villain could have ever been. "I'd love to help," Peter said, his voice clear and steady. "This is exactly the kind of work I've been wanting to get involved in." And just like that, Peter found himself drawn back into a world where he could make a difference without the need for Spider-Man. It wasn't the superhero work he had once done, but it was still important. It was still about making the world a better place, one person at a time. In the following weeks, Peter threw himself into the project. The new program was a fusion of his scientific expertise and his deep belief in the power of community. Using his connections in the tech world, Peter helped design digital platforms to connect students with mentors, and he used his knowledge of education and psychology to craft outreach materials that spoke directly to kids in underprivileged neighborhoods. The program grew quickly, attracting volunteers and donations from across the city. The work was fulfilling in ways Peter hadn't expected. He wasn't battling supervillains or swinging through the streets, but he was still changing lives. There were kids, just like Marcus, who were finding a path forward, who were seeing a future beyond the one they thought was the only option for them. And through the process, Peter rediscovered a part of himself he hadn't known. He'd lost the pure joy of helping others in a way that was meaningful, sustainable, and real. One night, as Peter sat alone in his apartment, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He had found his place, not as Spider-Man, not as someone seeking immortality or heroism for the sake of it, but as Peter Parker, the man who used his gifts and his time to give back to the world. He realized now that immortality wasn't about living forever. It was about leaving something lasting behind, something that would outlive him, something that would continue to inspire long after he was gone. Mary Jane, always the steady presence in his life, walked in with a cup of tea and sat down beside him. "You've been working a lot, Pete," she said gently. "I know you're doing great things, but don't forget to take care of yourself too." Peter smiled, leaning back into the chair. "I'm starting to get it, MJ. It's not about how much time you have. It's about what you do with it. And right now, this feels right." Mary Jane Sip's eyes softened as she watched him, her love and understanding evident in the quiet of the moment. I sips proud of you, Pete. You stir making the world a better place. Peter looked out the window, his gaze shifting toward the lights of the city, the streets, the people, the life that pulsed through the heart of New York. It was all part of the journey, part of his purpose. He didn't need to swing through the streets anymore to feel like he was making a difference. The work he was doing, the relationships he was nurturing, the change he was sparking in his community, it was enough. And in that moment, Peter Parker realized that the life he had was more than enough to leave his mark on the world. He wasn't immortal, and that was okay. He didn't need to be. The legacy of who he was, who he had always been, was already taking root, and that was all he needed. As Peter settled into his new rhythm, working alongside the community to inspire change and better the lives of those who needed it most, he began to see the ripple effects of his efforts. His work with the mentorship program flourished, gaining traction among the city's youth and even attracting attention from city officials who saw the potential for broader, citywide impact. What had started as a small initiative was growing into something far bigger than Peter had imagined. He wasn't just changing lives, he was reshaping the future for many young people who had been overlooked, giving them a shot at a life they might have never imagined. But even as his work took center stage, Peter knew that there was something missing. His life felt full in many ways, but there was still a quiet ache, a yearning for something more. The city was changing, yes, but so was Peter. He had embraced his role as a mentor, a teacher, and a community leader, but there were times when the call of Spider-Man's responsibility still echoed in his mind. It was on a particularly quiet evening, when the city seemed unusually still, that Peter found himself on the rooftop of a familiar building. The night sky stretched out before him, and he could see the twinkling lights of New York far below. He hadn't donned the suit in months, but as he stood there, he couldn't help but think back to those nights when he had fought for justice, not for himself, but for the city that had given him purpose. Could he really leave that all behind? Could he truly step away from the fight for good? He had tried. He had focused on his work, on his relationships, on building something that would last. But there was always a part of him deep within that had been shaped by the idea of Spider-Man. That responsibility, that need to protect, was ingrained in his very core. Even if he had found peace in other areas of his life, the pull of the hero within him was always there, quietly waiting to resurface. Peter closed his eyes, letting the cool wind brush across his face. The choice was his to make, but was it possible to let go completely? Could he still be the man he wanted to be without the mask, without the suit? The thought that he had moved on, that he was no longer the man who swung through the city in a blur of red and blue, was comforting in some ways. But there was a part of him that still wondered if he was truly done, not just as Spider-Man, but with everything that Spider-Man had come to represent in his life. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, a voice he hadn't yet heard in a while. "I thought I might find you here." Peter turned to see Mary Jane walking up behind him, a concerned look on her face. She had always known him better than anyone. "MJ," he said with a small smile. "I didn't hear you come up." She stepped closer, her eyes full of understanding. "I know you've been thinking about it, about Spider-Man." Peter sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "It's hard to shake it off, you know. I've been doing so much good in a different way, but I can help but feel like there's more I could do, more that only Spider-Man can do. I built this life, but am I running away from what I really am?" Mary Jane reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "You've built a life, Pete. A good life, and I know you'll always have that part of you. the hero. But what you're doing now with these kids, with your community, it's real. It's not just about stopping a villain. It's about making sure there's a world for people to grow into. You don't need the suit for that. You've proven you don't need to wear it to be a hero. Peter looked at her, the depth of her words settling in his chest. She was right. He had built something real, something that would outlast his time as Spider-Man. The work he was doing now was changing lives, just as Spider-Man had. The city needed him, but it didn't need him to be the man in the suit anymore. It needed Peter Parker. He smiled softly, the uncertainty that had been clouding his thoughts starting to clear. You always know what to say, darn, sit you. Mary Jane smiled back, a twinkle of affection in her eyes. They stood there for a moment in silence, watching the city together. Peter realized that, in a way, he had always been connected to the city, not because of the suit, but because of who he was. His powers, his choices, his responsibility, these things didn't define him. They were simply a part of what made him the man he had become. And even though the world would continue to need protection, Peter understood now that there were other ways to be a hero, other ways to make a lasting difference. So, what's next? Mary Jane asked, her voice breaking through his thoughts. Peter looked at her, a sense of clarity settling into his heart. We keep moving forward. We keep building, keep helping. The world is always changing, but we can shape it. I don't need to be Spider-Man to do that anymore. I just need to be me. Mary Jane smiled, and Peter knew that this was the beginning of something new, not just for him, but for the world around him. He didn't need immortality or the constant thrill of being Spider-Man. He had found something more valuable, the knowledge that true heroism wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about the quiet, steady work that made a difference in the lives of others. And Peter was ready to continue that work with all his heart. As weeks passed, Peter found himself more content in his new path. His community initiatives continued to grow, and he watched with pride as young minds were nurtured and guided. His work with local organizations, especially the mentorship programs he helped design, was beginning to take root in ways that felt meaningful. It wasn't just the projects themselves that brought him fulfillment, but the faces of the people he worked with, the students, the volunteers, and the families who were beginning to see a brighter future. The city had changed, yes, but so had Peter. He no longer saw the world through the lens of a hero who was constantly fighting against the tide. Instead, he had found a way to be a part of that change, to make a difference from within the system, to support people in ways that didn't require webs or costumes. He was still Spider-Man in his heart, but he had evolved into something more, someone who could contribute without needing to be on the front lines. But even as Peter settled into his new life, the world had a way of reminding him that there would always be new challenges. It was one late afternoon when that reminder came in the form of an unexpected phone call. Peter. A familiar voice crackled over the line. It's Nick Fury. Peter paused, surprised by the call. Nick Fury, the ever-watchful leader of S.H.I.E.L.D., was someone Peter hadn't expected to hear from. Fury was a man who operated in the shadows, dealing with global threats while Peter had chosen to stay closer to home. He thought the days of covert operations and world-saving had passed him by. "What's going on, Fury?" Peter asked, his voice calm but curious. "We've got a situation," Fury replied, his tone serious. "Something's stirring, Peter. A new threat, one that's been off the radar. We need someone who can think fast and move quickly. Someone who's not just about brute strength, but someone who's, well, someone who understands the balance of power. Peter hesitated. The weight of his decision to step away from being Spider-Man had been significant. He had made a promise to himself that his days of jumping into world-saving adventures were behind him. But there was something in Fury's voice that told him this wasn't something that could be ignored. "I've been out of the game for a while," Peter said slowly. "I've been not the guy you need for this anymore." Fury was silent for a moment, as though considering Peter's words carefully. "I know you've moved on, but this isn't about being Spider-Man, Peter. This is about your skills, your intellect, your ability to think on your feet, your connections. The world might be changing, but that doesn't mean your talents are any less valuable. You don't have to wear the suit to help us." Peter sat back, his mind racing. This wasn't just another villain or an epic showdown. It was a reminder that his time as Spider-Man had given him something more than just his physical abilities. It had given him the experience and insight needed to make decisions that others couldn't. He didn't have to be Spider-Man to make a difference. Maybe it was time to step into this new role. "All right, Fury," Peter said finally, his voice steady. "Tell me what's going on." Fury laid out the details of the situation. An underground criminal network that had been operating globally, moving in the shadows and bypassing traditional law enforcement channels. It was complex, involving cybercrime, illegal tech, and potentially global destabilization. The situation had reached a point where S.H.I.E.L.D. needed someone who could track the pieces of the puzzle from a different angle. Someone who understood the interconnectedness of systems, who could make sense of patterns in a world that was increasingly driven by technology. Peter listened carefully, his mind already whirring as he began to piece together the possibilities. The scientific and technological implications were clear, and though this wasn't the kind of fight he had once faced, it was still a battle for the future. This wasn't about swinging into action or putting on a mask. This was about using the skills he had honed over years of experience to prevent something much larger from happening. "All right," Peter said again, this time with more certainty in his voice. "Miss, it'll help, but I sit not doing this as Spider-Man." "Understood," Fury replied, his tone unreadable but satisfied. "You still be needed soon. I said they'll send you the details. We still be in touch." Peter hung up the phone and sat there for a moment, feeling the gravity of what he had just agreed to. He had stepped away from the physical battles, from the superhero antics, but he had never truly left the fight. The world would always need people who could make a difference. Even if he wasn't wearing the suit anymore, Peter Parker was still capable of stepping up, of using his skills to help where they were needed most. In the following days, Peter threw himself into the work, tracking the data, analyzing the connections, and piecing together the information that had been scattered across different regions. He worked alongside Fury and other S.H.I.E.L.D. operatives, using his scientific mind and his knowledge of the city to help identify the players behind the criminal network. It wasn't the most glamorous work, and it didn't involve the high-flying heroism of his past. But Peter found satisfaction in knowing that he was still doing something meaningful. As the weeks went on, Peter began to realize that this new role suited him in a way he hadn't expected. He wasn't the flashy, web-slinging hero he had once been, but he was making a real difference. His ability to think critically, his connections, and his scientific knowledge were just as important as any power he had once wielded. And in the process, he realized that he was more than just Spider-Man. He was Peter Parker, a man who could shape the world in subtle, impactful ways. The work wasn't done. The threat still loomed. But Peter was no longer afraid of what the future held. He had learned that immortality wasn't about time, it was about making the most of the time you had. And in this moment he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he had the tools, the skills, and the will to face them. Peter Parker may have walked away from the heroics of Spider-Man, but in his heart, he knew that his journey was far from over. He was still fighting, just in a different way. As Peter delved deeper into the new role he had reluctantly stepped into, the weight of responsibility felt different. He wasn't swinging across rooftops, dodging bullets, or trading punches with supervillains. This was a battle of intellect, strategy, and technology, a different kind of heroism. His scientific knowledge, combined with his street-level understanding of how the world worked, allowed him to untangle the complex web of illegal activities, hacking operations, and international smuggling rings that were part of this new threat. The criminal network was vast, its reach global. Peter soon realized that the mastermind behind it was someone far more dangerous than he had initially thought. The network wasn't just about technology or money, it was about control, about manipulating entire systems to serve a select few. But the more Peter learned, the more he realized that the people involved weren't just out for profit. They were trying to destabilize global economies and infrastructure, to put the world into a state of chaos, which they could then exploit. It wasn't just criminality, it was a calculated attempt at reshaping the world, and Peter had been pulled into the heart of it. Every day felt like a race against time. Peter and the team at S.H.I.E.L.D. worked tirelessly to uncover the next step, to track down leads and cut off their access to sensitive information. As much as Peter had come to terms with his role in the world, using his mind, his intellect, and his experience to fight for change, there was always a part of him that longed for the action, the thrill of doing something directly. He had learned to appreciate the impact he was making through this quieter, more thoughtful approach to heroism. But there was something about the urgency of this crisis that pulled him back into the kind of thinking he had as Spider-Man. One night, as Peter worked through the data late into the evening, a new piece of information came through, one that made him stop dead in his tracks. The criminal organization had a figurehead, a leader who had been operating in the shadows for years, manipulating people from behind the scenes. But what was even more disturbing was the connection this figurehead had to the people Peter had once fought alongside. The network wasn't just run by faceless criminals. It had ties to people within the very systems Peter had tried to protect. Government officials, corporate leaders, former allies, people Peter had once trusted. The very fabric of the world he had fought to protect was being used against him. The discovery hit Peter hard. He knew he couldn't trust anyone in his circle anymore. Not entirely. The betrayal, the complexity of the situation, it threatened everything Peter had believed in. His initial impulse was to confront the threat head-on, to face it directly, but he knew that wasn't an option anymore. The network was too embedded, too well placed in every sector of society. Peter had always prided himself on being able to take down the bad guys, but now he was realizing that sometimes the enemy wasn't a single villain or a tangible force. Sometimes the enemy was the system itself, the people who manipulated the strings behind the scenes. The question that weighed heavily on him was whether he could continue this fight. Could he trust the system to help him take down this vast, entrenched enemy? Or would he have to once again rely on his own instincts, stepping into a world where the lines between good and bad had blurred so completely that it was nearly impossible to tell who the real enemy was? The phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Mary Jane, her voice instantly calming him. "Peter," she said softly. "I know something Sep's off. You Seth been distant, and I can feel it." "What Sep's going on?" Peter sighed, his head spinning with the weight of everything. "And Sip discovered something, MJ," he said, his voice low. "Something big. It's not just the criminals I's fighting, it's the system. The people Sep trusted, they are all connected to this network. It's bigger than I thought." Mary Jane was silent for a moment, letting the gravity of his words sink in. "So what do you do now?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't know," Peter admitted. "Part of me wants to fight it head on, but I know that could make things worse. The system is so tangled up in this, it's hard to even know who sits on the side of good anymore." "You still figure it out, Pete," she said, the faith in her voice unwavering. "I know you will, but don't forget. Whatever happens, I from here. You don't have to do this alone." The reassurance in her words gave him the clarity he needed. For so long, Peter had been used to fighting alone, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But Mary Jane's words reminded him of something important. He didn't have to face this challenge alone. He had allies, people who cared for him, who would help him navigate this complex fight. As the weeks passed, Peter threw himself deeper into the investigation. He knew it wasn't just about fighting for the city anymore. It was about protecting the future, making sure that those who had been manipulating the system would never be able to control it again. He reached out to old allies, some from his days as Spider-Man, others from his time with S.H.I.E.L.D., bringing together a team of people who shared his vision. Together, they began to uncover the full extent of the network's influence and make plans to dismantle it. But even as the pieces started to fall into place, Peter knew there would be no easy victory. This wasn't the kind of fight he was used to. It wasn't about stopping a bank robbery or thwarting a supervillain's plan. This was a battle for the soul of the city, for the integrity of the systems that kept everything running. The stakes were higher than ever, and for the first time in a long while, Peter felt the weight of his responsibility. He wasn't just protecting the city anymore. He was protecting the very idea of what it meant to live in a just, fair world. As he walked through the streets of New York, watching people live their lives, Peter knew that the work ahead would be hard, possibly even dangerous. But he wasn't afraid. He had something now that he hadn't fully understood before, the courage to face any challenge, no matter how complicated or overwhelming, because he wasn't facing it alone. The days turned into weeks, and Peter found himself deeper in the thick of it. The web of corruption, manipulation, and deceit he was untangling was much more intricate than he had ever imagined. This wasn't a fight against criminals who wore masks or operated in the shadows. This was a fight against a system so deeply embedded within the very structures of society that it was almost impossible to find its source. Every time he thought he had uncovered the last layer, another piece of the puzzle appeared, showing him that the problem wasn't just a few bad actors. It was a system that had been rotting from the inside for decades. Peter's usual methods, the ones he had used as Spider-Man, didn't work in this scenario. There were no villains to confront, no clear-cut battles to win. The real enemy was far more elusive, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy, wealth, and power. Peter had no choice but to adapt. He relied on his intellect, his connections, and his ability to see patterns where others couldn't. But even with all that, there were moments when he felt overwhelmed. The city wasn't just being threatened by a single villain. It was being torn apart by those who had been hiding in plain sight. As the investigation continued, Peter began to realize the true scope of the threat. There were politicians involved, corporate moguls with too much power, and people he had once considered allies. The network was not just a criminal syndicate, it was a shadow government that had been pulling strings behind the scenes for years. And now, Peter was standing at the edge of something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. Despite the weight of the challenge, Peter knew he couldn't back down. He couldn't let fear or doubt stop him from doing what needed to be done. He had made peace with the fact that he wasn't Spider-Man anymore, but that didn't mean he had to stop fighting for what was right. This fight wasn't about capes or masks. It was about making the world a better place, one decision at a time. But it wasn't just about the city anymore. It was about something personal. Peter had begun to realize that the stakes were far higher than he had originally thought. The people behind this network weren't just interested in controlling New York. They were interested in controlling everything. They wanted to manipulate the world on a global scale. And Peter knew that if he didn't stop them, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for New York, but for the world. The closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous the situation became. He started receiving anonymous threats, messages warning him to back off, to stop digging, or else. But Peter wasn't the kind of man who could be intimidated. Not anymore. He had faced far worse threats in his life, and none of them had stopped him. This was different, but it was still a fight worth fighting. One evening, after another long day of digging through data and connecting dots, Peter sat at his desk, looking over the information he had gathered. He was exhausted, physically and mentally, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't turn away from this. The lives of so many people were at stake. Just as he was about to go over a new lead, his phone buzzed. It was Mary Jane. Her name on the screen always brought a sense of calm, even in the most chaotic of moments. "Hey," Peter answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "How's Sip's your day been?" "It's been good," Mary Jane replied. But there was an edge to her voice that Peter could immediately hear. "Pete, I'm worried. You've been so distant lately. You're not yourself." Peter's heart tightened at her words. He had been consumed by the work, by the responsibility of it all. He hadn't realized how much it was taking a toll on his personal life, on the people who mattered most to him. "I know, Menjay," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I've been so focused on this, I didn't mean to pull away from you." "You start carrying a heavy burden," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But you don't have to do it alone, Pete. You start not alone in this. We star in this together." Peter felt a sense of relief at her words. She always had a way of bringing him back to the center, reminding him of what really mattered. "I don't want to drag you into this," he said softly. "It's dangerous. I don't want you to get hurt." "I'm already in it, Pete," Mary Jane said with quiet strength. "I'm always been in it with you. We in this together, no matter what." Her words hit him harder than anything else. It wasn't just the battle against the system he was fighting. It was the battle for the people he loved, for the life he wanted to build. He couldn't do it alone. And he didn't have to. Mary Jane was right. He didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. She was there, just as committed to the cause, just as invested in making the world better. Peter paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. He had spent so many years pushing people away, trying to protect them from his burdens, but now he realized that the strength to fight, to keep moving forward, came from those relationships. He didn't have to face everything alone, not anymore. "Thank you, MJ," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I do without you." "I'm not going anywhere, Pete," she replied, her voice filled with love and conviction. You sub got me, always. With renewed strength, Peter sat back in his chair, looking out at the city that had become his home and his battleground. There was still so much to do, so many layers to uncover, so many people to protect. But he wasn't alone. He had his team, his friends, his loved ones, and together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fight for the future of the world wasn't over, but Peter Parker had come to realize that the greatest battles weren't fought in isolation. They were fought together, with the people you trusted, with the ones who believed in you even when you doubted yourself. And so, with that thought, Peter stood up, ready to face whatever came next. Not as Spider-Man, but as the man who had learned to fight, not just for the world, but for the people he loved. The path ahead would be difficult, and the challenges would be great. But Peter knew, now more than ever, that he was not alone. The days continued to blur together as Peter dove deeper into the heart of the conspiracy. The network that had been operating under the radar for so long was now being exposed piece by piece. But every step forward seemed to reveal a darker, more complicated side to the world he had once tried to protect. The criminals behind the operation weren't just interested in financial gain. They were playing a long game, manipulating global markets, governments, and entire systems of power to reshape the world according to their vision. Despite the daunting complexity of the task at hand, Peter kept pushing forward. Every piece of information he uncovered, every connection he made, brought him closer to the core of the conspiracy. But as the pieces came together, Peter's unease grew. This wasn't just a job for a scientist or a tech expert. This was a fight for the future of the world. And while he had always believed in the power of knowledge and intellect to create change, the stakes were growing higher with every passing day. Peter knew that it wasn't just about the fight itself. It was about the kind of world they were fighting for. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that the people behind this network weren't just seeking power, they were seeking control. An iron grip on the very systems that governed society, and to them, everyone else was just a pawn to be moved in their grand game. Peter's work was no longer just about uncovering corruption. It was about protecting the very idea of freedom itself. Mary Jane had been with him every step of the way, offering support when it seemed like there was no end in sight. She was his rock, the one constant in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. But she also knew that Peter was walking a thin line. The more he dug into the network, the more it threatened to consume him, to pull him back into the shadows of the hero he had once been. There were moments when he felt the pull of his old life, the rush of being Spider-Man again, the feeling of power and control that came with taking down a villain directly. But he couldn't go back. He had made peace with who he was now, with the man he had become. Spider-Man was part of him, but he wasn't defined by the suit anymore. One afternoon, after another grueling day of research, Peter found himself standing in the park, staring at the skyline of New York. The city had always been his battleground, his home, but now it felt different. It was a city of possibilities and potential, but it was also a city that could easily be torn apart by those who wielded power for their own gain. He could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him, but this time it was different. This time he wasn't alone. He had a team, a network of people who believed in the same cause, who were all fighting to create a world where justice wasn't something you had to fight for, but something that was a given. Pete. Mary Jane's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see her walking toward him, her expression soft but concerned. I'm just thinking," Peter said, turning to face her fully, "about everything. What we set up against. Mary Jane stopped in front of him, her gaze steady. "I know it's a lot, but you've already made a huge difference. You're not in this alone, and you're not fighting for something impossible. You're fighting for a future. A future where people like us can live freely. A future where the world isn't run by those who only care about themselves." Peter smiled at her words. She always knew how to make him feel grounded again, how to remind him that there was purpose in everything he did. "Thanks, MJ. I don't know what I do without you. I said always be here, Pete, no matter what." Her words were a balm to his weary soul, and for a moment the weight of the world seemed a little lighter. Peter knew that the journey ahead was far from over. The network he was fighting against wasn't going to back down easily, and neither was he. But with the people he loved by his side and the clarity he had found in his own heart, Peter was ready to face whatever came next. That night, as Peter sat at his desk, looking over the latest developments, a new piece of information came through. It was a lead that could bring him one step closer to the heart of the operation. A location, a meeting that had been set up by the masterminds behind the network. Peter knew that this was the moment. This was the lead that could bring everything crashing down. It was time to act. He gathered his team, including some of his trusted allies from his days with S.H.I.E.L.D., and began planning the operation. They weren't going in guns blazing. This wasn't a battle he could win with sheer force. It was going to require strategy, patience, and precision. Peter had learned long ago that fighting smart was just as important as fighting hard. He wasn't going to make the same mistakes he had in the past. This time, he was in control of the situation, and he was going to make sure it counted. The next few days were a blur of planning, research, and coordination. The team worked around the clock, piecing together the details of the meeting and preparing to make their move. Peter knew that this would be the moment that defined everything. If they could infiltrate this meeting, if they could expose the mastermind behind it all, they would have a chance to bring the entire network down. But the risks were immense. If they failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. As the day of the operation drew near, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of the world was once again on his shoulders. He wasn't Spider-Man anymore. But that didn't matter. In this moment, it was Peter Parker who had to make the difference. The choice was his. The responsibility was his. And he was ready. The night of the operation arrived, and Peter stood at the helm of the mission. His mind focused and clear. He had carefully planned every step of the approach, working with his team to ensure every variable had been accounted for. This was the moment that could bring everything crashing down, or it could be the start of a new dangerous chapter. But Peter wasn't afraid. Not anymore. This wasn't about being Spider-Man. This wasn't about the grand heroic gestures or battling villains head-on. This was about strategy, precision, and the calm determination that Peter Parker had always carried with him. The team gathered in their designated safe house, ready to move in. Peter knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. The network they were targeting had eyes and ears everywhere, and one wrong move could tip them off, resulting in a far more complicated and dangerous situation. This wasn't just about uncovering the criminals. It was about dismantling an entire system that had been operating under the radar for far too long. Peter glanced around at the people who stood with him, his old allies from S.H.I.E.L.D., the team of experts who had been helping him analyze data and gather intel. There was no trace of fear in their eyes, just the same determination he had come to rely on. Mary Jane had stayed behind, her support unwavering as always, but Peter could feel her presence in his heart. She had always been there for him. grounding him when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear. Tonight, it wasn't just about him. It was about all of them, and they were all in this together. "We move in as planned," Peter said, his voice steady. "We stick to the script, no deviations. We find the mastermind, we get the information, and we make sure it sits over. No casualties, no mistakes." His team nodded, each of them checking their equipment one last time. Peter, too, ran a final check on his own gear. It wasn't his Spider-Man suit, but it didn't matter. His mind was as sharp as ever, and that was all he needed. Tonight, the city was depending on him. The operation was set to take place in an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, an ideal location for a clandestine meeting where deals could be made away from prying eyes. The network had chosen this spot to discuss their next move, and Peter knew that if they could disrupt this meeting, they would be one step closer to unraveling the entire operation. It wasn't just about catching a few criminals. It was about taking down a system that had been allowed to fester in the shadows for too long. As they neared the location, Peter's heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that coursed through him. There was no turning back now. They were in the final stages. Every second mattered. The team moved silently, their footsteps light on the cracked concrete as they infiltrated the warehouse. Peter signaled for the team to split into smaller groups, covering different entry points. The element of surprise was their greatest advantage. The building was dark, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. The sounds of distant voices echoed through the halls, muffled but clear enough to identify the presence of their target. Peter could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment settling over him like a heavy cloak. He'd faced threats before, but this felt different. It wasn't a fight for survival. It was a fight for the future of everything he had fought for. The stakes were higher than ever. They reached the heart of the building, the room where the meeting was taking place. Through the cracked door, Peter could make out the shadowy figures of the criminals gathered inside, their voices low and deliberate. They were discussing their next moves, but Peter's focus was on one thing: the leader, the person who had orchestrated everything, the person who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Peter motioned for the team to hold their positions, preparing for the moment when they would make their move. His heart was steady now, his mind clear. He wasn't Spider-Man, but he didn't need to be. This was his fight, his responsibility, and he was going to finish it. This was the moment he would show the world, and himself, that he could make a difference in a way that didn't require a mask. The door creaked open, and the team moved in, swift and silent. Peter was the first to step into the room, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The criminals inside froze, eyes locking onto him, and for a split second, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Then, before anyone could react, Peter spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is over," he said, his tone commanding. "You Sith be all going to answer for what you Sith done." The leader of the operation, a man cloaked in shadows, stood up slowly, his cold gaze meeting Peter's sips. "You think you can stop this? You stir just one man. You have no idea what you sipped dealing with." Peter didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I sif am dealing with," he said, "and I sif am done letting you hide in the dark." In the moments that followed, the room erupted into chaos. The criminals attempted to scatter, to fight back, but Peter's team was ready. The carefully laid plans unfolded perfectly. No mistakes, no missteps. Peter moved with purpose, coordinating the takedown of each individual, ensuring that every move was calculated. He wasn't swinging from buildings, but he was still making a difference. He was using his intellect, his knowledge of the system, and his understanding of the people he was up against. Within minutes, the situation was under control. The mastermind behind the operation, the leader who had remained elusive, was in custody. The rest of the network had been dismantled, its connections severed. The fight wasn't over, but it had shifted. They had won this battle. As the dust settled and the last of the criminals were taken away, Peter stood in the center of the room, looking at the faces of his team. They had done it. The world wasn't saved in one dramatic moment. It wasn't a single victory. It was a series of small victories, each one adding up to something greater. And tonight, they had struck a blow against the shadowy forces that had tried to control the city. Peter's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Mary Jane. He took a moment before answering, the relief in his chest finally sinking in. "You did it, Pete," Mary Jane Sepp's voice said, filled with pride and warmth. "I knew you would." Peter smiled, feeling the weight of the night begin to lift. "We did it," he replied. "This wasn't just me. We are in this together." And for the first time in a long while, Peter understood that the true victory wasn't in defeating an enemy, but in knowing that no matter what the future held, he would face it not as Spider-Man, but as Peter Parker, with the people he loved by his side. The dust settled, and Peter stood among his team, the city outside still bustling with its usual energy. The mission was over, but the fight was far from finished. Peter had seen the depths of corruption that ran through the veins of the systems he once believed in, but he had also seen the power of collaboration, of coming together to bring down forces too entrenched to be fought alone. As he looked out at the skyline, Peter realized something profound. The heroism he had always sought was not about wearing a suit or fighting in the streets. It was about making decisions that shaped the future, using his knowledge, his compassion, and his connections to create change, even when it seemed impossible. He had always feared that without Spider-Man, he would lose his sense of purpose, his identity, but in truth, he had found something far more powerful. He had found the ability to affect the world on a deeper, more lasting level. There were still battles to be fought, injustices to be addressed, and challenges ahead. But Peter knew now that he didn't have to do it all alone. He had a team, he had Mary Jane, and he had his community. Together, they would continue to fight, not just for survival or against one villain after another, but for something bigger, the vision of a better, fairer world. As the city lights twinkled below, Peter realized that the legacy he would leave wasn't one of endless battle, but one of quiet, meaningful impact. The world would continue to change, but he had given everything he had to make sure that the changes would be for the better. He had made a difference. Not because of the mask he wore, but because of the man he had chosen to become. Peter Parker may have stepped away from the world of Spider-Man, but in the end he had discovered that true heroism wasn't about immortality or defeating villains. It was about living with purpose, using the time we have to shape the world, and leaving behind a legacy of love, justice, and resilience. And as he turned back toward the life waiting for him, one filled with love, hope, and the promise of change, Peter knew that he had found his true path, not as Spider-Man, but as Peter Parker, a man who had learned to live fully in the present while shaping the future with every choice. This was only the beginning.